So I just clicked on my.
And we're live, evidently. Hey, everybody, this is Tom Lynn here today, the 23rd of October, 2024, AD, BCE, what have you. And I'm here with the great, as I've said on other occasions, inimitable Kamal Southall. And we're going to just be shooting the breeze today about this essay. I've done a few, I think I did three little videos respectively. I don't know if summarizing is quite the right word, but uh, reflecting upon in a summary fashion the major moments in this essay, Vernacular Values by Ivan Illich. I'll put a link to that in the description. And Paul also has read the essay and being also a person committed to an expansive view of the world, has some thoughts, but we just thought we'd kick it about a bit just to get things going. I've been on hiatus for a while, so we're gradually reacquiring momentum. Uh, Again, before we really get going, I just want to apologize to all of you about the sound. I'm working on it. I don't know why sound issues tend to bedevil me. So if the recording is difficult, I apologize. Hopefully, that's not actually the case. Similarly with the light. But in any event, sort of housekeeping remarks to the side, again, the essay we're sort of talking about vernacular values by Ivan Illich. And he has sort of three broad moments in that essay. One where, well, I'll get out of the way. I'll just turn it over to Kamal here and ask for his sort of initial response to the essay, how it affected him, and so forth, what he perceived to be its major claims, or what have you.
Well, hey, it's great to be with you yet once again, and thank you. I, I'm really glad that you turned me on to this essay. You have this habit, this custom of being able to turn people onto interesting text, and no, I enjoyed it. I found it very interesting. One of the things that struck me as interesting, and you have a much grasp, you have a greater grasp of Evan Nealich's body of work and his thought um, than I do. I mean, I find his essay on conviviality to be um, really interesting, especially in this present juncture, going through much of what we've experienced over the last few years and finding ourselves, I think, in a social context in which conviviality is sorely needed. And I'm sorry, just one second. Sorry about that. I just had a little bit of technical glitch over here. No, but this essay in particular, it struck me as really fascinating. Like, there's many interesting points that he hit. It's such a wide ranging essay, but what I found really interesting was his points on uh, Nivreja and um, his project of marrying language and arms as instrument of empire. And so I am familiar with some aspects of Castilian history, some aspects of Spanish history. Um, you know, prior to the Reconquista, I have a immense intellectual interest in the history of Andalusia and the Moorish um, era in Andalus. and all and also the formation of the early Spanish Empire. But I was completely unaware of this particular incident and how it fits into the formation of modern Spanish, or Castilian Spanish, properly speaking. And it discussions of Nebriega's engineering to some degree, the Spanish language as we know it, as a gift to Queen Isabella. Not only was this something that I was not familiar with, it was a matter of fascination, but I mean, it strikes me as, please stop me if I'm um, babbling a little bit too much. It strikes me as really interesting because this is like a social engineering project, and it's an immense social engineering project, um, in the furtherance of conquest and empire. And it's
So,
not. Mhm.
just by way of some elucidation, as someone listening to the interview who may not be previously familiar with this circumstance to which you're referring, this linguist Antonio Elia de Nebrija, who was a Latinist and a linguist, and he's discussed at some length by Illich in the essay. I would implore you to go to this essay, or he talks about him in other books as well, such as ABC, the alphabetization of the popular mind, I think is the name of that book, but which he co-wrote with somebody else. But Nebrija in 1492 submitted a petition to Queen Isabella of Spain to furnish her with the first standard grammar of the Castilian, or what we would know as the Spanish. A surprisingly late development, in my view, of a grammar for a modern language. And the a lot of Illich's analysis in the essay talks about how it's different. There's a difference between this mode of standardization, which is being posited by Nebrija, and the sort of standardized grammars of ancient languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and so forth. But and then I'll turn it back to you, Kamal. Illich also notes how Nebrija in his petition to Queen Isabella sees this as as contributing to this project of burying letters and arms in the name of the Spanish imperial conquest. So that's sort of about what you're driving, but maybe you can then build from there and elaborate upon what you found impressive about it.
I mean, I should remember that the ja in Spanish is pronounced uh, like el jefe, not jefe. So Nebrija, Nebrija. Um, but
Nebrija
yeah,
or Nebrixa. There are
okay.
two different ways of spelling it that I've encountered.
So it's I found I found it interesting. I mean, it's like one thing that Illich mentions is that his proposing and presenting this grammar to Queen Isabella was like not even a fortnight after Columbus sail in 1492, which I find to be really fascinating because Christopher Columbus set out ostensibly in search of a passage to the east, to China and the Indies. Um, and this is a project of empire. It's a mercantile project of empire, meant to sort of uh, cut out you had the rising um, Turkish Muslim powers, the Ottomans, and the various regencies that they were setting up along the Mediterranean coast in North Africa and in West Asia. Um, and also you have, the quote unquote Moorish powers in Morocco and Algeria, modern Morocco, modern Algeria, modern Tunisia. But at the time, these were, the kingdoms of Fez and Marrakesh and Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, more like city states in possession of large swaths of the North African coast in a certain sense. And so this is initiating a sort of prototypical setting out and voyages of conquest, right? To acquire commodities, to you know take to the seas in the name of the sovereign, to establish the cross in foreign lands, to enlarge the domains of the monarch that one is serving. And so that's an external push towards empire, right? But here, what Nebrija is proposing to Queen Isabella is a sort of internal push in empire, and I find that fascinating. I find that very fascinating because I mean, we're not used to thinking of this. We're not used to. Well, I'm speaking for myself. Um, I think oftentimes the sort of conventional discourse concerning empire building that we encounter in school or in documentaries doesn't stress the internal dynamics of empire building. But if you're going to build an empire, this kind of project necessitates a sort of kind of social engineering. You have to engineer a new person who will be a subject of that empire, right? Which involves language and discourse. Uh, so arms and language. And it's interesting that he chooses the Castilian vernacular. And Illich mentions that one of the thoughts that he had, that he expresses to Queen Isabella, is that he realized when he was in his 40s that he could take the common vernacular speech of the people and make it into a language. So, what is the distinction between a language, properly speaking, in his thoughts, and just the vernacular common speech? So, he writes a grammar and he writes a dictionary. And these two projects would be are absolutely normal in our present era. But this was something groundbreaking at the time where he was. So that just interested me. It struck me as rather fascinating, and particularly given Illich's uh, commentary prior to getting to that point in the essay on the vernacular and on subsistence, and if um, so, those are some of my thoughts. If I could ask you, your thoughts, like there's a couple interesting points that really struck me. Um, one of which is, he's referencing Alfonso, King
Yeah,
Alfonso.
the 13th century, I think, Spanish monarch.
Yeah,
I
and
think he was 13th century.
I think to a
Um,
certain degree, he would be more of a Castilian monarch. And this is what struck me as interesting. We are used to thinking in categories like Spanish, but it's kind of dawned on me that that category thought of ethnicity of national identity that's an innovation. It's something quite new because prior to the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, can we really speak of a Spain? There's an Iberia, right? But Iberia was divided into multiple kingdoms, in Aragon and Castile, and to some degree, the cultural identities of these kingdoms, they can't neatly be called Spanish, per se, not in the modern sense. There are French aspects of some of these territories closer to the borders of what's now modern France. There's a certain linguistic uh, continuum that many of these areas occupy, but not all of them. There's the uh, Langue d'Oise, and the Languedoc, and that's where we get Landoc. I'm barbarously mispronouncing it, but to this day, um, in Spain, in cities like uh, Barcelona, for example, you have a local vernacular that's not Castilian. It is a Romance language, it's Romance vernacular, but it's of the langue d'oise, which was also the language of the other troubadours, um, and it was a distinct variant of Romance. But the langue d'oise, it was the tongue of those who say we, versus the tongue of those who say up, from my understanding. But there are multiple dialects, multiple tongues being spoken, multiple vernaculars. And to shape Spanish as we know it, as Castilian, he isn't just picking out Castilian, he's choosing a specific dialect and specific register and making that into language. Just as to some degree one could say um, Dante in trying a particular dialect later became the foundations of Italian. But just like Italy existed as a region, did it really exist as a nation prior to Mazzini and Faravelli and um, the unification of Italy in the 1800s? And in the same sense, did Spain really even exist prior to the 1490s with the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand and the union of their two kingdoms? And one thing, I
Oh,
mean, simple answer.
there you go. Not to
Yeah.
be too curt about it, right? But this is one of the things that arises as through the course of this essay, at various points, is how we just don't understand. Don't It's difficult for us to appreciate because we're in the midst of of at least a more mature, if not concluding phase of modernity. Um,
Mm,
just how novel the artifices of modernity are, and the nation state is on that list of comparatively recent developments that we are tempted to think of as perennial features of human civilization, or even Western civilization, but such is not the case. They really are uh, entities of comparatively recent provenance. And with regard to how that arises in the essay, yeah, there's the notion of creating this standardized tongue, which is authorized by the state as a way of consolidating that identity and also of squelching or diminishing other sort of independent vernacular uh, flourishes. So it's interesting. It might be to sort of flesh it out that, uh, and Illich talks about this in the essay as well. The relationship to the printed word, which is in the background of these proposals of his. And so, and I didn't really appreciate this myself, but apparently with the early printing, as printing emerges in Europe, right? There's actually an immense propagation of a language printed in the vernacular, and we tend to see um, literacy as something which needs to be brought to people. But in fact, ironically, Nebrija was concerned with an excess of literacy, especially literacy in vernacular or indigenous tongues. So one of the motivations for his project is to try and bring under the control of the state the actual correct ways of speaking, so as to extend control over people's ways of being. And Illich then goes on to say that this actually becomes the first real commodity. And this is sort of pre-industrial, but what he's talking about is you're creating a need. You're creating a need. The scandal is that no one needs a grammar to learn how to speak. No one needs a dictionary to exhibit fluency in a given tongue. And yet we have been conditioned to believe that it is precisely through the standardization of grammar and vocabulary and ways of reading that you really come into your fullness as a human being. But this is at such odds with historical reality that it even scandalized Queen Isabella. She was, in fact, reticent to uh, take up the Briha's proposal. It was only at the behest of, and he cites it, you know, I believe one of the local clerics, one of the bishops in her entourage, as it were, that she eventually exceeds. And the notion is that the language itself then becomes testimony not only to her greatness, but also to the greatness of the project of modernity, which is setting up a new understanding of human being. And this is why the category of the vernacular is important for Illich, because the vernacular arises of its own accord in local conditions, or maybe more than merely local conditions, but in a manner which is independent of the propagations of authority. Uh, the idea of progress, married to some notion of science, while on the one hand calling for a broader embrace of human freedom, actually demands an incredibly authoritarian political structure to bring into effect the designs that it actually has for the world, as you see pretty explicitly, for example, in Francis Bacon's Novum Organum and in other works of his, and Descartes and Machiavelli and all the rest of it, right? And the idea of capturing language fits hand in glove with that project. What does that have to do with the nation state? Because it seems like I've gone a bit far afield. The nation state, I would argue, sort of presages something which happily hasn't happened yet, but a total state, a total and absolute state, which then holds utter sway over what it is to be a human being. A rather sort of and Elich takes this question up in another book of his, Gender, the manner in which human beings have to be sort of sterilized to make them uh, implements of maximum utility for a resource or for a commodity intensive society, right? And by manacling their tongues to state approved forms of language, you're taking a major step forward in that regard. Also, it anticipates how the notion of education is reconfigured. And I've been going on for a bit here. You know a lot about that stuff, and I wonder what your thoughts were because he discusses, for example, that classically there's a distinction between education and instruction that actually follows sort of gendered lines where women in educatio um, are educating, and education means more like nourishment as opposed to instruction, which is sort of how we tend to use the word, um, which is undertaken usually by the male, the masculine. Um, there's also, in addition to this, I'm raising another line which works in tandem with this language line. Like it's such a rich essay, um, where education gets reconfigured again to this project of standardization. I gotta just turn it over to you. I mean, what are your thoughts there? Maybe on the whole education question, since you know a lot about that stuff.
Oh, right. Well, a lot. It is something that fascinates me. Something that's interesting, like along those lines, is so his interest in the vernacular, right? Uh, Counterposed is the industrial. And so in his essay, he looks at, in looking at the industrial and industrial modes of production and industrial modes of being, and looking at also like commodity based cultures, right? And so he proposed sort of schema with three axes, an X, a Y, and a Z axis. He organizes early on in the essay various tendencies, right? So the vernacular, uh, I guess you could say the vernacular is opposed to the industrial, and the hard as opposed to the soft, left, right, uh, a way of life. Our economies, our ways of life, our ways of being based on having objects, having commodities, accumulation versus doing. And so the vernacular, if I'm understanding his point right, is more concerned with doing, right? And in a kind of independent mode. What I the impression I get from reading him is, the vernacular is characterized by a sort of independent, organic, well, not independent in that the individual is an atomized being, right? Because the vernacular is within a broader social context. Individuals, from my understanding of, if I'm understanding what he was writing correctly, you have individuals who are um, pursuing subsistence, and they have vernacular modes of doing things, of learning things, of within a broader kind of social, convivial context, um, as opposed to, and it's organic in a manner of speaking, as opposed to a sort of top-down, um, dictated, directed project-based sort of model that's industrial, involving industrial production of commodities and then the industrial consumption or having them and accumulating them. Um, so it's a culture, for example, our social system, our social context in which people find pleasure in having things, right? We're collect things, we can buy neat little things and define ourselves by these things versus finding pleasure in doing. And I thought that was rather interesting. And he begins the essay looking at development, sort of models of development developed, no pun intended, are conceived of primarily what we would call the first world, and directed at the development of the third world, or the quote developed world right there, posing models of development to the underdeveloped world or the developing world. Um, and these kind of massified projects really characterize a lot of the that's all a post-colonial um, industrial powers in looking at other the other people who were not of that industrialized kind of central imperial, seemingly post-imperial world. Um, and he looks at how this development of seeing the others change, as barbarians, looking at the other outside of one's society as barbarians, for example, and how the Greeks saw barbarians, how the Chinese, from the perspective of the Middle Kingdom, the ancient Chinese, how they saw those outside of their borders, these barbarians are the Romans, and then how this starts to change into the within Christendom, into the concept of the pagan, and how even the notion of the pagan as someone who is in need, needing Christ, needing salvation, needing conversion, and then into our sort of uh, into the era of modernity and getting to his historical juncture. You have the others outside of the, I guess, colonized, former colonizing empires, and they have subsistence modes of life, industrial modes. So what do they need? They need development. They need industrialization. They need infrastructure, and that necessitates um, the inculcation of modes of thought. That so you need people who can run this infrastructure once it's built. So you have the industrial apparatuses, and people must be instructed and educated to reproduce the models of industrialization at the center, or what sees itself as the center, among the periphery, if I'm reading him correctly. So
Yeah.
development, human development
This,
as far as institutions. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, it ties into the marriage of letters and arms that you noted at the outset, right? That it's done to, you know, um, that's what I was going to say.
No, very much so. I mean, and
And
that's an early prototype of. I mean, looking at the Spanish Empire, it was certainly a prototype for the. And it's interesting. You mentioned Bacon. And Bacon's project of English modernity, or British or British modernity, is very similar in a way, although more instrumentalized. And I think in Spanish, the Spanish crown, the Spanish kingdom, built this empire in the New World. Um, I guess they were the first, empires had come and gone. This they, in a certain sense, instituted first modern empire in a certain manner of speaking. The English came to it uh, later. Yeah, I had to catch up. And this was the central project of not just the Tudor dynasty, but particularly of Elizabeth's reign, right? And you have these thinkers, John Dee, marrying metaphysics and the magic and the occult of the medieval period. That sort of mode of thinking was religious and a spiritualist, and one that sees the world, the metaphysical. categories of, you know, gradations of being, um, where some things are more real than others. The realm of spirits being more real and to some degree than the physical realm, but at the same time, bringing that to a very pragmatic, practical, scientific mode of thinking. Because he was just like Newton, you know, much later, but still within that sort of crossover period. Newton was sort of the, I guess, the last of the great sorcerers of the English and the first real modern scientists. In a certain sense, Bacon is in the middle bridging this, and without the thought of Bacon, Newton wouldn't have been conceivable. Um, Without the thought of both Bacon and Bede and others, but particularly I think Bacon within that same moment was crystallizing these things. So John Dee, it's like he had a foot and a half, 1 foot and a half of his other foot in an older world. Bacon is, I, I kind of imagine him pulling his foot out of the older world and trying to segue into a new world that largely his thought was crystallizing. And then you have the later flowering of the Royal Society and people like Newton, and then this sort of um, high scientific intellectual elite of the 1700s going to the 1800s, the high era of British Empire. So that that model needed the Spanish model. The British Crown were in conflict with the Spaniards at the same time to become this sort of to become an empire ruled from an island. You had to borrow that Spanish model and innovate upon it and develop it. And
I
so
think,
I
oh,
think we have
sorry.
similar. Please go ahead.
I was going to say, a figure that comes up in the Illich essay, the connection with those developments with alchemy and so forth, is John Amos Comenius, I believe. He's actually Czech, uh, but also sort of brings an alchemical orientation to bear on the question of education. Now, he
Mm,
actually comes about a generation and a half or so after Nebrija. So it's later things have started to flesh themselves out a little bit more, but he's just another chap who's working in the same register as Bacon and Bacon's Epigenes. Um, and but this whole alchemical notion of purification to bring forth the true gold. I'm just now, as I'm speaking, realizing that that is actually also at the heart of Nebriha's project. So he takes the vernacular Castilian and uses it literally as raw material. He doesn't respect it for what it is in itself. It has to be refined by standardization so that it can become really a vestibule to other attainments, such as the old classical languages of Latin and Greek and so forth, right? There's this alchemical notion of purifying to bring forth the real gold. It could be said to, really speak to what is happening with science as it's initially framed in modernity. And it actually puts me in mind of the Descartes framing that it's about lordship and mastery and control of nature. And that this is what sort of undermines or will subsequently corrupt uh, the scientific project. This refusal to be open, if you like, to what the world simply discloses itself to be. And that shows up also in our ways of being. We can't just let people be as they are. And that's like what he says is differential about what happens after Christianity. There is always an antipathy or an uneasiness about the other, the barbarians or what have you, but it wasn't necessarily yoked to the desire to conquer them. And even when they weren't about to be conquered, they were just, employees. They didn't try and necessarily eliminate their languages or their gods or anything like that. I mean, that all sorts of nasty things happen. So don't let me romanticize the ancient world. But something happens with Christianity where that is no longer sufficient to dominate people through systematic violence. You have to get into their minds and their souls so that they can become truly human. There's an incredible hubris there, which is, of course, a corruption of Christianity, not what Christianity, in my view, properly wishes to bring to the world. But as Illich himself was fond of saying, the corruption of the best is the worst. And so there's all that. I don't know if you have a response to that. After that, I was going to I have another question.
But
Joe, but
well, that's sort of going back to the Briha. So there's an interesting usage, uh, a use in unruly language. So, beside that, okay, a certain chemical transformation of a base material, right? That's kind of implicit in the project that he proposes to Isabella, right? Because uh, the language of the time, the old Castilian language, as he saw it, was loose. It was unruly. It was, a language of marketplace, of the street, of soldiers, and so on and so forth. So thinking about that idea, right? Unruly language. Right? What do you want to do with something that's unruly? Well, someone who finds a problem with the unruly would want to make it ruly. You would want to rule it. You would want to make it instead of letting it be loose. You would want to make it unruly. You'd want to rein it in and rule it, and hence dominate. Um, and English mentions he uses a Christopher Columbus, and it's an interesting point. There's a certain cosmopolitan nature of Columbus, right? He grew up speaking Genovese, but it was an older, much older um, dialect of Genovese. Um, Something that would not necessarily even be recognizable today, right? And he spent time in Portugal, right? And of course, the Portuguese of that era would not have been the Portuguese of our era. And there's remarkable similarities between Portuguese and Spanish, but it was still, at that point, it was a distinct tongue. It was distinct mode of speech or dialect. It was, distinct dialectical mode. And, Columbus learned Latin and multiple other, you know, no doubt, Italian dialects and so on and so forth. So he spoke Castilian, what we would call Spanish today, um, as an outsider. Interestingly enough, he would have spoken and written it, as this points out, in a Portuguese mode. So, like, think about that. This is a very unruly linguistic situation, but it's a very cosmopolitan one. You have one man who contains in himself multitudes. Right? He contains in himself a multitude of tongues, able to speak to a multitude of different people in different modes. Maybe not fully at home in each one, but in a very unruly, loose way, able to communicate. The Briha wants something that's tight and polished and centralized and governed, right? Because, well, a speech that's ungoverned is uncontrollable. So you mentioned earlier the situation with printing, and if you have an um, well, central to imperial governance is not just governance of the limbs, the pocket, you know, the marketplace, and but governance of the mind to a certain degree, particularly in modern empire. So, how do you govern one's mind? You govern the means by which that mind is taught, the means by which the mind is communicated to. Hence, you govern language. You refine the language. You mentioned Queen Isabella um, might have been the person who first coined the idea of good taste based on her erudite uh, readings of classical literature for home pleasure. So this was a woman who was erudite, who was polished. She was intellectually attained, and integral to her worldview was the notion of good taste. Nabriha brings to her this notion of governed language, which, as you mentioned, she was uncomfortable with. But the crown does adopt this. And that strikes me as very interesting because this is pre-industrial, but in a certain sense, couldn't we say that this is a sort of model of industrialization of language? You produce a grammar, a set of rules that's prescriptive, not descriptive, prescriptive, and a dictionary. And these are the two coding tools. And with that, you're basically centrally setting in motion a linguistic machine in a certain manner of speaking. And that's me speculating going beyond the text, but this just strikes me as interesting.
Well, yeah, and then there's one other line of reasoning that he offers in the text that sort of builds on all this, right? And that is the notion of the mother, the maternal state, right? And here, and I don't know enough to really assess how uh, controversial this is, but he looks at how the Christian church begins to conceive of itself as a mother. And while at first this seems a relatively uh, benign development, over time it transmutes to the notion of the authoritarian, one might even say the devouring mother, right? And then this then gets grafted onto the modern state. So, if you want to talk about the real rise of the industrial and its ultimate ambition. Its ultimate ambition is the supplanting of the family and the supplanting of your actual mother. He does this both with the analysis of how the church conceives itself as a kind of maternal institution, but also how the history of the term mother tongue actually sort of shakes out. And well, as contemporarily, the the idiom suggests simply the tongue that you learned at birth. In fact, what it comes down to is the tongue which is approved by the state. And then he concludes with a rather, I think, startling anecdote, which really, I think, throws everything else into relief about um, what can potentially happen with language, with the industrial mode of being, and so forth. And that's where he goes to his friend who's living in think somewhere in the Bronx, but an impoverished portion of New York City, because his friend wants him to sign this petition for um, pre-K language assistance, I believe, pre-kindergarten language assistance, and he goes to this the disastrous tenement where his friend is living, really in aesthetic solidarity with the poor there, and notice that these children are in an environment which, while terrible, and impoverished, is also incredibly rich linguistically. They got English and Spanish and Yiddish and, four or five languages, albeit chaotically and mixed in this uh, sort of slum where they're found. And Illich is like, why do you not want them to just take from that enrichment? And he uses the term castration. He didn't want to continue the castration of these children by committing them to systematic linguistic education. And he and his friend talked at sort of cross purposes about this for a while until Illich says he realized something. He realized that tragically, his friend, whom he had adored, had, in a sense, ceased to be a parent and become, I think the phrase he uses, the total teacher. So instead of in local, well, instead of acting as a parent, he is acting in place of the teacher in local magisters, or local magistri or magistris. I think it's in local magistry, but in a kind of rhetorical flourish, contrasting it with the legal term in local parentis, right? But I thought that was very striking that parents are encouraged by our contemporary milieu to sort of give away their own authority over their own children because of the apparent rectitude of the state that sees itself as the supreme mother. I don't know, what do you think about that? I mean, we can get very psychoanalytic, but what do you think about that aspect of the essay?
And it's interesting that he mentioned so the notion of the church as mother, or the centrality of motherhood, but a sort of authoritarian motherhood. He mentions that the image of the church as mother that seems to not have any real root in romanity, like in the ethos of pagan pre-Christian Rome. The sort of central maternal authority. You can't really find that. I mean, there's Juno, mother goddess. There's that, and he doesn't mention that, but just that comes to mind that there are maternal deities and maternal figures of power, but you don't have this image. He posits, I guess, for example, the state as a mother, right? Of but the idea of the church as mother, he traced to most likely Syria, and most likely, you know, passed into the Mediterranean from Syria in the third century through North Africa, and it reaches its flourishing in the medieval period. So the mother, the mater, is domina. Well, what does a mother do? She teaches her young, she nourishes them right, she brings them up. So you have this central institution that's an that's conceived of as a nourishing, educating, but also domineering and powerful nurse and nurse maiden and um, matrix within which the body of the church collectively um, finds itself. I guess in her womb or in her bosom. So
It's
this.
interesting
Go ahead.
in
Hmm.
is they use the word matrix, and that's etymologically interesting because my understanding is the word matrix is originally the word for womb,
which was
which
interesting.
I find quite apt. People talk about how we live in the matrix, right? But it's actually consonant with this whole line of analysis because we do live in a dark matrix, right? It's the womb of the industrial. It's the womb of uh, of the system. It's not your mother's womb, right? And also the fact that we are detained within the womb also speaks to how we are apparently in a culture of arrested development. You don't emerge from the womb and cut the umbilical cord and then go forth, to realize yourself as a person and the way you would historically, right? There's this notion of unending childhood, even infancy. I mean, of course, in a way, it just sounds, you can go too far with it. We have to stay grounded, right? I don't want to go totally crazy with it, but I think it's very suggestive linguistically that these images recur in our general speech.
I think so. You know, it bespeaks of, I think, an apprehension of rather profound realities, or an intuition of profound aspects of the reality of the situations in which we find ourselves. And it comes out through our speech, sometimes almost against us, or, beyond our conscious control. We um, perhaps in our speech indict um, the system in which we find ourselves in ways that our conscious mind hasn't grappled yet. But to some degree, perhaps there's a culture-wide knowing, or societally widespread knowing, and so it filters out into our speech. Or maybe some of it is perhaps used in our speech to regiment our mind to the reality of you know being within this womb. What's interesting is that Illich is very interested. Well, it strikes me as interested in the notion of bureaucratic control, and so we have a womb-like maternal matrix that's an encompassing system. It's an encompassing industrial system, um, and it requires experts. It requires expert management, and at the level of linguistic teaching. So, in taking away our earth tongues to a certain degree, the tongues.
Yes, yes. And then
the-
also,
yeah.
I'm sorry, it just
Oh,
like
please.
as you're talking to build on that, the whole culture of expertise and the need for this technocracy, right? You can also look at how technical language has become increasingly a kind of almost impenetrable argot. And then at times it's not even spoken. There's this kind of special symbolism of mathematics, which in its own way echoes uh, alchemical semiotics, right? It's just to build on that notion of creating this culture of expertise to uh, guard and control.
Right. It's and this culture of expertise kind of mirrors the church in itself. It's in a certain degree a successor. to what the church was in Christendom, um, with the priesthood possessing expertise, expertise of the classical languages, expertise of the rites and rituals and prayers and ceremonies, and we have teachers and Democrats, and no indictment to people for fulfilling social roles. And there's a prescriptive aspect. Well, no, there is a critique that I think I pick up in his writing, but there's also a descriptive aspect, just describing the situation he sees and then describing what he sees as its historical, philosophical antecedents, um, and the result, right? So people can, people have social roles in a society. You have garbage men who are, to some degree, technicians, literally sanitation engineers, and they have a social role, and they're trained, and they have their trucks and their procedures. They carry through these procedures, and these procedures keep, ideally, our environments free of rubbish, right? Our One has politicians who have expertise within our states, people, um, policymakers. It runs across the board, but there's a structure, and the structure replicates itself at each layer of our society, at each layer of our present day industrialized, uh, post-industrial, to some degree, um, developed world, quote unquote Western. And I find the term Western and the term of West and East to be very problematic. Not to go on a tangent, but people use it. So we have this.
It is prop. Sorry, go on.
No, you no. Please continue. Yeah, you were saying.
Well, it's something maybe we could take up in another conversation because it does seem that Illich is suggesting that there is something distinctive which happens in what we call the West culturally. And he's locating that distinctiveness, I think, principally within a cultural revolution that is uh, more or less set off by Christianity. It revolves around how the individual is considered in its relationship to the divine. It does seem distinct from how that same question is addressed in what we could call the East. So we, of course, must be very cautious. We must avoid tying this tendency, tethering it unduly to geographical or ethnic categories. But it does seem like he's onto something, right? In terms of two qualitatively distinct ways of navigating human being. Uh, but of course, maybe I'm just amiss there. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And my discomfort with the category of and label West, um, really sits outside of his essay and outside of his thought. It's more of a problematizing with, I think, with certain conventional ways of seeing the realities described are alluded to by Trump. And within his concept, like it's, I, and especially given the time at which he was writing as well, um, the way he sees the West and the way he sees the historical development of Christianity, within the West, and the emergence of, um, this mode of being, looking at, um, this particular moment in Castilian and Spanish history, for the instrumentalization of of a language, and it's to a certain degree a recreation of that, or maybe a creation of language anew, and then the instrumentalization of it as a tool and instrument of empire. This is all very Western, clearly. I mean, within that particular sense, I mean, whether we're speaking of Western Christendom, um, Roman, Catholic Western Christendom, mm, at a distinct period of time in history. Um, and so that makes sense. One thing I find interesting, so we spoke of, the maternal and matrix and mother tongues, right? Um, and English has had some very interesting thoughts on the notion of the mother tongue itself and mother tongue that's taught. Um, what are your thoughts about what are some of your thoughts? I'm curious about where he was going with the notion of not just the maternal but also mother tongues.
I think he was just, I mean, I'd be inclined to again recur to that sort of closing anecdote that he provides. I think he is asking us to appreciate, uh, well, I mean, a useful, an additionally useful observation which can be brought to bear here is that monolinguality, the notion that one speaks only one language, is quite anomalous. In fact, people historically tended to get along in several languages, not just one or two. Uh, the fact that there has sort of just like in agriculture, there's been a promulgation of monoculture. He's sort of warning against a monoculture of language, which works perfectly fine if you want to propagate a monomaniacal empire, but it doesn't work quite as well if you're just trying to navigate the seas of life as you are organically or spontaneously or as you go about your day. And I think he wants to get rid of the notion of the mother tongue because as an ideal, it sort of ties us to this notion that we really only have one or two tongues. In fact, that's a ridiculous misportrayal of human potential. Uh, that I mean, it's straightforward. He's several examples in the essay of friends of his who are very humble origins who have no formal education but who get along in three or four or five tongues. And yes, of course, perhaps they are not comparably fluent in all of them, but in fact, that is the norm historically. It's a kind of indictment of contemporary culture that it seems so, uh, at least in our part of the world, so anomalous to be in command of more than one tongue. And the other thing is, you don't actually learn those languages. I mean, you can, but people who are polyglots after that fashion, it's not like they took a bunch of courses. They picked up those tongues just by being in certain environments, which is really how we learn to speak. And now one doesn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it can be inferred that one thing in which he's gesturing is the degree to which the renovations of education has really hamstrung our own potential. And this is something he brings up in connection with comedians, right? We've only really learned something if we've been taught it. We have that notion that you have to have the imprimatur of formal schooling in order to really be in command of something. But that is a specious and unfortunate development. So that's a, sort of the vicinity to which I think he's ushering us with his criticisms of the mother tongue.
Yeah. And it's interesting how he does make the distinction that the mother, which it, wait, it's kind of interesting that we have, we collectively have been conditioned to use certain terms in certain ways. Like we're often conditioned to see mother tongues as a vernacular, but something that he makes very clear in his essay. After looking at the notion of the vernacular and etymological relationship of the term vernacular with, if I recall correctly, with rootedness, right? Which is
Yeah.
which which suggests the soil. Um, the mother tongues aren't vernaculars. Considering that vernacular is not like the vernacular language is not the mother tongue. And yeah, the vernacular, this is something that we acquire, we learn. It grows in us, right? From environments that we find ourselves in. And you know what's interesting? I think now this is gross stereotyping, but I find it interesting that um, worldwide, it seems to be like a global stereotype. The the nations that are often most seen by others as being characterized by um, characterized as monolinguistic monocultures, I guess you could say. If we think about them, they're all empires. Right? So that it kind of an
They're,
Anglo-American. I'm sorry, go ahead. Let's continue.
right. I just didn't hear what you said.
Yeah,
They're all, what did you say they were?
empires, former empires. Okay, so France
Yes.
and the French and the codification of the French language as a French mother tongue. It was bureaucratically codified by experts, based primarily on the Parisian dialect, in the wake of the Revolution. And this, there are things about the Revolution that were certainly laudable, and um, you know, a an emancipatory event within European history, from the tyranny of those estates that lorded over those without pants, the sans-culottes, and deprived them of their bread and oppressed them while they pranced around with their lace in Versailles and so on and so forth. But there's an interesting, I would almost say, cult of expertise, cult of scientific and cultural expertise that in itself was a very interesting cultural development, but it became, um, I think, out of the ideology of the goddess of reason and the religion or cult of reason that the Enlightenment philosophers, um, whose ideals I think the revolution was meant to epitomize, um, it it sort of coalesced on this notion of an enlightened, rational um, expert. And I think to some degree, not to be critical for culture, it's just it's an observation. we Americans or British or other nations have similar analogs. But you saw at that point a flowering of expert managed intellectual projects, and the codification of the French language and its maintenance bureaucratically was one of the projects, not projects. And it's very similar in the with the Italian unification. Again, there was a selection of a particular dialect. The Italians weren't particularly good at empire, and even to this day, there's some linguistic variety within Italy. But then we come to the British Isles, and there's a stereotype that's often found worldwide that the English, you know, when one shouldn't say the British because the British collectively are multilingual. Um, Gaelic and Cornish and Welsh, and many people within the British Isles who speak multiple languages, natively and otherwise. But the English, particularly, to beat up on the English, is again, I'm just repeating stereotypes that may have a
Right.
seed of truth. But have this, have this reputation as being particularly monolingual, which isn't a fair stereotype, but it is the case. In America, even more so, there's a sort of global reputation that America has of being monolingual, primarily first and foremost. Japan, now the Japanese islands are islands, so they're insular, right? Literally. So one doesn't have contiguous land-based contact with other nations, but there is a sort of um, sometimes the Japanese have. I am wading into dangerous territories, but the Japanese sometimes have a reputation of being very monolingual, as do the Chinese. And these aren't indictments. It's just looking at the sociological phenomenon.
There's
You
a
have,
correlation of sorry to interrupt.
I mean, it's
I
even
think
said,
that we um there's a strong correlation between uh, monolingual, maybe not strictly. There's a tendency toward monolinguality, which is highly correlated to imperial political projects.
I believe so. Yes, not correlation isn't causation. It's a
Well,
cliche,
the
but
correlation is suggestive. Suggestive. So we have been talking here for about an hour. We should maybe wrap it up a bit. I didn't know if you wanted to maybe offer a concluding remark as to something about the essay in particular, which you felt you wanted to walk away with.
I so two things that kind of strike me as interesting and make me want to explore his thought more along these lines. There's the notion of subsistence, which, um, as I think you've noted, is not the most glamorous or sexy terms or ways of describing something that's a very important step in his thought, and it strikes me as very interesting. Um, and the vernacular itself. I mean, I would like to further explore these ideas. Like
Excuse me.
it seems to me that instrumentalized manners of dealing with the world um, can have certain gifts, and they bring certain material benefits. What I, not to sound too woo-woo or um, flaky, um, but I kind of feel like I intuit from reading him a concern with the organic, the living, the human as opposed to the machine. Um, the outflowering as opposed to the rigidly standardized. Um, and the central role of language within this essay, it's kind of inspired me to think of ways in which our languages, how our languages are taught to us, um, modes of acquiring versus being taught or learning other languages. Like I I have an interest in learning multiple languages, and I'm not particularly good as as an adult language learner. But many of the ways in which I've tried to learn other languages, whether it's French, Spanish when I was younger, I forgot almost all of it, Arabic, those dialectical, um, it's called daraja, which actually, not to go too far afield, but I find something interesting. So the Amiya among the Arabs, you know, is kind of just the natural speech, and there's multiple modes and forms of it. Um, but there is this idea of a prescriptive, defined classical um, Arabiya, and there, there's a prescriptive grammar and things of this nature. But looking at the history of that, that, that occurred at a certain point in time in history, which I think also can be correlated to older empires. Um, the older Abbasid caliphates and so on and so forth. And even within what's seen as a rigidly defined classical Arabic, there's actually an immense amount of diversity that's there, but it's not really focused on in contemporary Arabic education. There's a look at a very limited scope of that classical language, much less than the spoken vernaculars. But one thing that this essay caused me to reflect on is that a lot of my attempts to learn other languages weren't focused on acquiring them, actually. Although that some of that's happened, like I've acquired things from my wife, for example, because she's multilingual. I've acquired things of her vernacular. Um, I've learned more French from her than I ever learned in school, which isn't to say very much, much less than Arabic. But maybe look, so rigid, standardized way, grammar, dictionaries, you have these drills and so on and so forth. That's not the way to acquire the soul of a language. Maybe it's a matter of environment and connecting with people and connecting with their hearts, picking up what you pick up. Um, so,
Claymont.
mm.
So,
What about
I mean, to
yourself?
be helpful, say. Um,
Because I rambled too much.
no, you're fine. I mean, as far as it goes, I found the essay. And again, as I speak about it, I'm realizing just how dense it is. There's so much going on. What initially drew me to it is the way in which he invites us to dimensionalize our understanding of social, economic, cultural, political questions, and so on and so forth in a more uh, multispectral way. It's not just left versus right. It's hard versus soft technology. It's industrial versus vernacular ways of being. I think that that framework is powerful in itself. And then his exploration of language and its connection to empire. Uh, Also compelling. Um, and I need to go more deeply into where he goes with vernacular as opposed to industrial modes of being, in terms of our relationship with work and the domain which he defines as really normative. He didn't say it, but it's implicitly normative for him. The domain of subsistence or the domain of the vernacular is structurally set apart from that of the industrial or the economic. But there is a sort of mirroring of those two worlds where the same action can be conceived of as existing within either of them. And what determines as to within which of those realms you are finding yourself inhabitant is the manner in which you are relating to the work. And when that work is just being done in the service of commodity production, you are essentially cut off, I think, from, if you like, the spiritual ground of real human life. So that's what I took from it. So I think maybe we
It's
can
so
wrap
rich.
it there for the moment.
Yeah.
Um, Again, thanks everybody for listening, by the way. And Kamal also, excuse me, also has a YouTube channel, and I'll post a link. Sorry, guys. Excuse me. I will post a link in the description to his channel, so you should check that out. And he might put this interview up on his channel too, and he'll, I don't know, we'll see. But I think that's that for now. And thank you as always, Kamal, for being an enriching interlocutor
Well,
of an impressive command of history.
it's an honor and pleasure to met with you, and thank you for your thoughts and your ideas and your edifying command of the material never fails to astonish me. And maybe at some point later this week, I would love to maybe pick your brains about um, Homo economicus and Homo industrialis uh, within Illich's other, because you've both makes mention of that, and the sort of like serfdom imposed by wage slavery and wage-based labor. And I would really find it fascinating to hear more of your thoughts on those aspects of his work. But it's a
I
pleasure,
need to
man.
do more work in that regard as well. So I think he's taking cues from Eric Fromm, but I'm going to stop before I start. So, and I'm going to bid you good night, sir, and I'll
Good night,
talk to
Tom.
you soon.
It's a pleasure.
Uh,
Take care.
all right. Ciao for now.